Well, hi, Carrie. Carrie from, I guess she's your boss, Kristen, eh?
Yes.
Well, that's great to have your folks on the Winter Woodlot Conference agenda, Carrie. It's wonderful you could take the time to make this presentation happen. I was saying to Kristen and Heather, we get a lot of folks viewing them after the fact on our YouTube channel, the recordings and that. So very happy about that. All right. Well, I think I better stop sharing this for now, and we'll get on with things. So just want to say first, thanks to Dorothy for all her hard work and the committee in pulling this great conference together. Lots and lots of positive comments on our first two sessions so far. And the Kemptville Winter Woodlot Conference is another success. So thanks, Dorothy. And I want to turn it over for a couple of minutes to Tony Bull, president of the Eastern Ontario Model Forest, and also stalwart OWA member out of our Renfrew County chapter, to say a few words. Go ahead, Tony.
Thank you very much, John. Well, I just want to say that this Winter Woodlot Conference is a long-running tradition, and this one is very good too. It will be so good to be able to get together again in person. It's just so much fun being face to face. But in any case, I just want to say, as you did, thank you very much to Dorothy and the others who put this together. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the presentations.
Right on. Well, thanks, Tony. Thanks for joining us too. So yeah, we're still people coming in, but again, the recording will be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. And I know again, lots of people are taking those in after the fact if it didn't work out for today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to the Forest Gene Conservation Association of Ontario, and I'll let Heather introduce her colleague and co-worker, Kristen, who's going to do the presentation today. So go ahead, Heather.
Thanks, John. So climate change will no doubt have an increasing impact on forest health and our ability to establish trees. In this session, we will review some of the predicted impacts climate change will have on Ontario's forests, as well as individual tree species. We will then explore some of the tools we can use to mitigate those impacts, maintain diversity, and create resiliency in our forests. Kristen Sandvall, our presenter today, is the Seed and Climate Change Coordinator for the Forest Gene Conservation Association. Kristen manages FGCA's seed management expertise in climate change adaptation programs. Her work includes seed orchard management, assisted migration trial establishment and monitoring, training and certifying seed collectors, and supporting partners in their strategic climate change adaptation projects. Prior to her work with the FGCA, Kristen worked in the nursery industry, growing native plants from seeds for over 7 years, and has participated in local and global seed exchange initiatives during her schooling at the Niagara Park School of Horticulture. This is a really interesting talk, very informative, and I think you're all going to really, really enjoy it. So take it away, Kristen.
Thanks, Heather. I'll get my screen sharing going here. Okay, everybody can see that?
Looks great.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And hello, everybody. I'm happy to be joining you as part of the Kemptville Winter Woodlot Conference on behalf of the FGCA. Just to give a little bit more of an intro, FGCA in general is we're a not-for-profit organization that assists forest practitioners to conserve and augment genetic diversity of our forests through species conservation, seed management expertise, climate change adaptation, education, and advocacy. Today, I'm here to talk more specifically about some of our climate change adaptation work. We all know that climate change is going to change the world around us, and this includes forests. The forests playing such an important role in our world, we want to do everything we can to ensure they will be resilient in the face of climate change. The FGCA does a lot of work with practitioners, forest managers to integrate climate change adaptation into their programs. Recently, we were happy to work with Forest Ontario to do a climate change analysis as it relates to their planting programs. We looked at the threats climate change brings to the current planting program through predicted climatic changes, as well as some of the tools we can use to add resilience to the planting program and in turn our future forests. Today's talk includes some of the results of this analysis, along with some other additional tidbits I've added relating to seed and climate change information as it relates to Ontario's forests and woodlot owners. To give a bit of context here, the FGCA are not scientific researchers. We like to consider ourselves more as translators, keeping up with and bringing current science to practitioners in a way that applies to their specific programs. This work is meant to guide changes, but not necessarily dictate the exact steps that should be taken. By no means is this a one-size-fits-all approach, and work should always be used in conjunction with local practitioner knowledge. Also, as great as modern climate science is, it's not a guaranteed prediction of the future. Our environment is an incredibly complex system, one in which we don't fully understand the potential each species or ecosystem will have to adapt or not adapt. We may not have all the answers, but we know we must act, which is why we try to take a best bets, no regret approach here at the FGCA. So when we began looking at an analysis like this, we need to consider a few things. The climatic changes predicted to occur, current species suitability versus future species suitability, the effects to planting conditions or site conditions in general when we are assessing existing forests, and of course, being a genetic association, we always go back to our roots and how genetics play a role in all of this. Last, but certainly not least, the foundation to any planting program, along with forest regen, is seed. Small but mighty packages of genetic information that will determine our future forests. We need to explore what our options are for seed in the future to really ensure resiliency. First, let's take a step back here for a minute. Why is climate change an important factor in our forest anyways? Details aside, looking at the basics of historical climatic changes and how species have responded, we know that natural migration of a species can typically shift about 10 to 50 kilometers in a century, assuming no large migration barriers exist, aka things like the Great Lakes. Now let's compare that with the rate of climate change, which is predicted to shift up to 700 kilometers this century. Our forests have never experienced something like this before, so it's safe to say they may need a little help. How do we know the climate is going to change like this? Well, this is where predictive modeling comes in. And a bunch of really smart folks put together a bunch of data to show future predictions of our climate based on how much CO2 we continue to put into the atmosphere. Three main representative concentration pathway scenarios emerged. RCP 2.6, considered a low CO2 emission scenario, 4.5, middle of the road, 8.5, a high emission scenario, aka we continue our business as usual. Recent studies have shown we're currently following that 8.5 pathway. This doesn't mean we can't still change and doesn't mean everything will play out as predicted, but it's a good indicator of the direction we're going. The image on the left shows an example of how the three scenarios differ in mean annual temperature for Ecodistrict Forest 4 in Northwest Ontario. And you can see that the climate really diverges depending on our actions. Ontario is a very diverse place climatically. And for this analysis, we couldn't look at all areas in detail, which is why we selected just a few ecodistricts to represent some of the diversity, while still being able to dig into more localized data. Included in this analysis is 6E11, which you can see on the map here is just west of the Kemptville area with fairly similar climate. There are a few things we know about the direction our climate is moving, and we've seen some effects of that already. We know that temperatures are increasing, precipitation is increasing, however slightly, and weather is becoming more variable. But we need to look deeper than this to really start to see the impacts at a local scale. We need to look at various climatic variables and how they may interact to affect tree growth and survival. One of those variables is climate moisture index, which is essentially the net available moisture for tree growth after factoring in temperature, evapotranspiration, and precipitation. AKA, it can be considered an index of drought. All eco-districts analyzed show a downward trend over time, which equals less available moisture for that tree growth. Some eco-districts in the 8.5 scenario actually have predicted CMI values that drop below 0 by the end of century. This is of concern because this is the line we know forests have trouble supporting a closed canopy if long-term levels remain below 0. Even in eco-districts that remain above 0, they're still lower than historical values and are predicted to experience an increase in drought. Drought, which will increase the difficulty for seedling survival and establishment on planting sites, as well as stress to existing forests, which could negatively impact growth, overall health, and regeneration of the existing forest. It can also leave forests more vulnerable to attack from insect pests and diseases. And moving forward, we should look to use methods that reduce site level moisture loss and disturbance, which exposes soil, as well as trying to incorporate and encourage more drought tolerant species and sources. When we look at long-term averages like seen on the last slide, it can be a bit deceiving when really climate moisture index looks like this, where it could be high one year and very low the next. This is important to remember that even with long-term values remaining at a good level, there can still be years of extreme drought and variability, which can have long-term negative impacts on tree growth. For example, a study of aspen trees in the West showed that an extreme drought event can impact the growth of trees for 5 years afterwards. Even with, say, extreme drought occurring every 10 years, that could potentially lead to these trees experiencing a reduction in growth 50% of the time. This could have dramatic effects on the growth in our forests. Climate moisture index considers temperature and precipitation, but we also want to look at these variables separately. Using 6011 as an example here, on the right, we can narrow in on some predictions of changes in precipitation for specific times of year. We can see the first 6 weeks of the growing season, along with the rest of the growing season, is expected to see an increase in precipitation. Mind you, looking at the actual values here, the increase is not very big considering the temperature increases during this time period. This leading to more moisture being lost to evaporation and transpiration, and why CMI shows an ultimate downward trend. You may ask what this information could tell us that CMI can't. Well, we know that precipitation is going to be more variable, and this increase in precipitation does not translate to even distribution of moisture, but rather large rain events, which can cause flooding. This affects planting and establishment conditions, but also poses issues for our landscape and infrastructure. Natural functioning ecosystems that include swamps and wetlands will be critical for mitigating the impacts of extreme events. We need Mother Nature's sponges more than ever. We also know that many species, especially northern climate species, do not like the heat. And with such a large rise in extreme heat days, this is likely to increase stress on many species in Ontario. Another aspect that was not included in this particular analysis is the effects of this change in climate and weather on winter conditions and the winter harvest period. There is potential for increased snowfall, but also more potential for freeze-thaw cycling and an overall reduction in frozen ground time, effectively decreasing the winter harvest period. Another variable we looked at is growing season length. This we know is another important variable for tree growth with a strong link to local adaptation. With growing season length affecting things like bud set, bud break, and in turn can have a significant influence on growth potential. Like we talked about before, we're going to see change like we've never seen before, with growing season length increasing by as much as 60 days by the end of the century. Importantly, what does this look like in the terms of a tree's growth cycle? In relation to the climatic changes predicted to occur, our forests are used to a short growing season, where all their essential life cycle functions must be complete in a relatively short time frame. So what happens as the climate changes and the growing season length increases? These trees are programmed for our old climate and no longer able to take full advantage of the new growing season. So how do we help our forests shift their life cycles from the old to the new and take advantage of the increased growing season? We have a few tools at our disposal along with a tree's natural plasticity. So here is our example scenario. We have our current forest adapted to a short growing season. We know the growing season will increase, while current forests are unlikely to change enough to account for this increase. So what if we bring in some tree seed from a climate closer to the future predicted climate? And another source closer again, and perhaps we bring these together to allow the various sources to mingle, and in their offspring, we have a mixing of genetics which have greater diversity and a greater chance to adapt. And of course, a new growth potential to suit the increased growing season length. This was a basic example of a concept called assisted migration. Often I think assisted migration is thought of as bringing in new species which historically have not grown here. This is not always the case, and generally what we recommend as an organization is to work with widely distributed species and assist through population migration within a species' natural range. This is the first recommended action and is low risk when done strategically. So we know we want to find more adapted sources, and we need a tool to help us find some. The tool we use is Seedware. Seedware is a tool that can help us identify target areas based on climate similarity. On the right, you can see an example Seedware map for Eco-District 4S4 with ideal target areas for seed procurement highlighted in orange, indicating a matching climate of 90% similarity or greater to the current climate. What we really want to find is areas that match the future climate of 4S4 to procure seed from, and we can start by looking at a near future scenario. The example here is showing target areas for seed procurement for the near-term future, landing in central Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. We then take a look even further into the future, which brings us closer to southern Minnesota and central Wisconsin as target seed procurement areas. Generally, we recommend bringing in a diversity of sources from different timeframes adapted to various predicted climatic conditions. We also need to be careful, though, to not look too far into the future so that any sources brought in can tolerate the current local growing conditions. Also, to keep in mind, these are only target areas based on climate and should be combined with local soil data and species range data to determine suitability. How about a look at future predictions a little closer to Kemptville? So you can see in the near-term period, we can look to Eco-District 74 in Ontario, as well as central Michigan, northern Illinois, and some isolated areas in New York. And for the longer-term period, we can look to northern and central Illinois, Indiana and Ohio, and a few other smaller locations. Target areas for seed sourcing can vary a lot depending where you are in Ontario. One thing we know with seed sourcing, it's not going to be easy to find the right seed when we need it. For areas like parts of northern Ontario, we'll be targeting places like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, which generally have more forest and so hopefully a better chance of sourcing seed. With those better sourcing options comes better chance of genetic diversity. They also have more established forestry and nursery operations, which may help with sourcing as well. On the flip side, for Southern Ontario, on the other hand, our sources will be Southwest Ontario, the Southeastern Midwest, our primary target areas. This is cause for concern as there's very low forest cover in these areas, fragmented populations, limited sources and genetics. Sourcing for Southern Ontario is going to be difficult. Many of the eastern states and South Central Appalachian contain target areas for various parts of Ontario, providing a few more options. As well, they have better resources than the Southern Midwest, but can be difficult to find appropriate seed due to the variability of climate along the Appalachian states and a lack of pinpoint source data for them. To give a bit of a visual description of the issues we'll be facing in the near future, we need to answer the questions of how in the heck are we going to save this forest when this is the forest we have to source from. Luckily, we have a few tools we can use to maximize seed use, increase genetic diversity, and increase seed production in the province. The first being seed orchards, which are plantations of select trees with superior qualities. These are usually clonal and have high input costs, the reward being high quality and quantity of seed and ease of harvest. Typically used for tree improvement projects and generally only make sense for feeding the larger timber forest industry. There are a few other options which have lower inputs and can be either a natural stand or a plantation. Seed production areas, being more intensively managed than seed collection areas, are often a good choice when resources are available to provide some management for specifically encouraging seed production. This so because we know we can increase our quality, quantity, and ease of harvest can be drastically increased from a natural stand. A seed collection area generally does not have much active management for seed production, but the main advantage being it's identified as a good site for collecting seed. The FGCA is working hard to create and maintain seed sources to help support the genetic diversity and health of our forests. We manage and maintain several white pine clonal seed orchards, primarily to support our sustainable forest licensees and Crown Forest managers. But we also work to plant, monitor, and maintain various assisted migration trial sites and future seed production areas. These are primarily hardwood species for the moment, focusing on core species like oaks, whose seeds cannot be stored or banked for long periods of time, like many conifer species can. We have limited resources to do this work and rely heavily on our partners to help with these efforts with the understanding of how important this work really is. Another avenue the FGCA is working to provide more access to seed is through a program we called the Seed Collection Area Network, SCAN for short. For years, the FGCA has been gathering and maintaining information on seed collection sites across the province. Currently in need of a bit of a facelift, we are working to have additional iterations of this where individuals could access to add seed collection sites and to create something that could really be used as a tool to help source seed for local projects, as well as climate change related seed movements. No matter where you get your seed from, there are a few key principles to remember to ensure high quality, genetically diverse seed, which is essential in the face of climate change. We should collect where there are a large number of individual seed trees to ensure they have had adequate cross-pollination, increasing their genetic diversity while decreasing the potential for inbreeding. This is especially important for common wind-pollinated species like oaks and pines. We want to make sure the individuals are healthy and vigorous and that we are collecting in a good seed year to make it worthwhile, but also because we know these are years that seed is the most genetically diverse and of the highest quality. It's also important to have very clear documentation of seed sources, whether it's for local use, but especially when making decisions for climate change related seed movements. So we looked at seed sourcing for the future. Now let's take a look at species. We started with this analysis looking at the bioclimatic profile of species, which identifies climate values where species are known to occur across their distribution range. We can then use this data to infer a variety of things relating to where it may be suitable for species to occur now and in the future. Now, we use the raw data for our analysis, but a visual translation to what you may be more familiar with seeing is something that looks like a range map. On the outside in brown, representing the full potential climactic range of a species, and the inner core in green, which is really more the happy place of a species. Out of this profile, we pulled mean annual temperature, as this climactic variable is strongly linked to local adaptation and species occurrence. We took this data and created box and whisker plots, which we can now use to represent a species range and compare it to others. For interpretation purposes, you can look at these boxes representing north and south along the vertical axis. The main green box generally representing the core range of a species, while the whiskers generally representing the full range of a species. Now we can add climate change to the picture through reference lines showing the changes to that mean annual temperature over time. So we identified the current mean annual temperature, as well as adding the predicted mean annual temperature in the future. Now we can ask a few questions such as, what species climactic ranges still overlap with the mean annual temperature of the future, and what species no longer overlap? Looking at the extent of the ranges, is there likely a chance to find potential adapted sources in the future that we can use in the assisted migration type movements? So to give you an idea of the information we can identify with these, I'll go through a few examples from our most northern eco district we looked at, and our most southern one, along with something closer to Kemptville. Starting in Northwest Ontario with Forest 4, looking at various conifers, you can see currently most coniferous species clearly are within range. Comparing that with our future predicted climate, most species are still well within range or just moving beyond their current climactic range. From this, we know there's a good chance to find more southerly sources for most species, which are more adapted to the future climate. And for other species, we can do our best to maintain good local genetics. On the flip side, for an area with minimal hardwoods outside of boreal species, you can see the future tells a different story with potential. Now, this doesn't mean you should go out tomorrow and plant a bunch of oaks in Dryden, but it does show the potential for informing integration of additional species to a planting program in the future. Keyword, of course, being informed. Now to take a trip down south, where there is a very different story to tell. A lot of conifers are still being planted for various reasons. Some of them rely really not in their ideal climates. Many afforestation practitioners in the south have already noticed the decline in planted species like white spruce. Looking at this, it's not hard to see why. These species don't have the option for assisted migration, as there are no suitable populations to source from. Looking at our future climate, you can see the conifers that remain in their climactic range are species like white pine and red cedar. It may be worthwhile to consider favoring these conifers over others. We know in the Southwest, many of these species are already in trouble, and we need to reduce their use when possible and encourage other species instead. Hardwoods, on the other hand, tell a very different story again. A lot of species are already in range, and most move further into range in the future. Here we know we have lots of potential for sourcing more adapted populations and increasing growth potential. Once again, I want to bring the story a little closer to Kemptville and take a look at 6011. Most species are currently in range, with some of the boreal species soon to be outside of their ideal climates. A similar story to the Southwest, with a bit longer time frame for many conifer species. Some of these species don't have the option for assisted migration, as there are not suitable populations to source from. Looking at our future climate, you can see the conifers that remain in their climactic range are species like white pine, red pine for a period of time, and hemlocks, although there are other issues to address there. We want to reduce the use of species as they become more maladapted and maintain genetic diversity in those remaining populations as we encourage other species to thrive in the area. The story of hardwoods in 6011 looked fairly similar to the Southwest. A lot of species are already in range, and most move further into range in the future, with a few new species to boot. Here we know we have lots of potential for sourcing more adapted populations and increasing growth potential. There is also potential for informed species range expansion for our more Carolinian species. We also used NRCan generated predicted species ranges and summarized them in a tabular way for easy reference and comparison over time. The images below showing a visual representation of the example above. So now we see that sycamore in this location is predicted to move into its core range in the future, but also something to note, looking from left to right, is that the shift in that species is not just south to north, especially apparent in the last image representing the 2070 to 2100 predicted range. Climate change is going to increase overall potential habitat in Canada, particularly for temperate species, but also for many species, it will also mean a reduction in high quality habitat, with species core ranges shrinking over time. Each species will experience a different shift in its ideal climatic range, and management of a species will largely depend on where it's located along this gradient. Natural populations on the southern lagging edge of a species range are likely to experience some level of extirpation, and our options for management range from assisted population migration out of these areas, ex situ conservation, and in situ monitoring. Populations that exist where the current and future climatic ranges overlap are likely to experience some level of local adaptation using standing genetic variation and gene flow, which we can of course help facilitate through assisted population migration. Now, areas which in the future will be new climatic niches for a species may experience natural migration into these areas from a species leading edge, but as we know, that's very limited, but we can of course assist through assisted range expansion where appropriate, and of course with caution. We can't go through every species in every area of Ontario, but generally speaking, temperate species with extended natural ranges are likely to see gains with climate change versus many of our boreal species becoming under increasing stress, especially along their southern range edges. This by no means considers all factors and cannot be blanketed across the province. Each species needs to be evaluated, not only based on climatic variables, but also their ability to adapt and function in each ecosystem. We want to encourage climate change winners to ensure the overall health of our forests into the future, but it's also still important to maintain diversity for its buffering capacity, as well as wildlife and ecosystem health. Encouraging winners and creating or maintaining refugia for more sensitive species is what we should be looking to do. This may mean encouraging oaks on those tougher upland sites while still maintaining hemlocks and lower valley edges. It also looks like diversifying conifer plantations or other sites that are monocultures or primarily one species. As a woodlot manager, this means considering all aspects in your woodlot and trying to maintain these species where they naturally do best. It also means ensuring sustainable harvest practices and a reduction in any high grading practices. The genetic quality and diversity of your current trees are going to be the primary contribution to your future woodlot along with your neighbors, which is also why collaborating with neighbors to create connectivity in your woodlots is important. We do a lot better with friends, and so do trees. Now to summarize a few overarching climatic changes which will affect our forests in Ontario, we're expected to see an overall increase in temperatures, but also extreme heat events and variability, which can cause stress to trees. We know we are going to see an increase in drought, which will add stress to seedling establishment and forest regeneration, especially in northwestern Ontario. We're going to see more variable precipitation, which is likely to cause site access issues, going from a dry site to a flooded site overnight, and of course, those winter harvest windows. We're going to see a longer growing season, which can lead to local population maladaptation, but also the potential for increased growth in our forest. We also know we're going to see an increased potential for species extirpation as species become under increased levels of stress, especially boreal species in the south. Changes are already underway, and we need to take action. Some of the first actions we can take involve maintaining species and genetic diversity. We can also look to integrate more drought-tolerant species, but this doesn't mean we should forget about the rest. Moving forward, right plant, right place is going to be more important than ever. We can also help mitigate the effects to sensitive species by focusing them in more music locations. We can also practice methods which reduce site moisture loss and consider changes to our planting and harvest. This will look different for everyone. For some, it may be shifting planting earlier in the spring. Some, it may be shifting more planting to the fall. This may also mean shifting harvest cycles. Also, for a few more actions that really help with resilience and transition of our forests, we can take actions like assisted migration, which should always be informed movements from population migration to range expansion where appropriate. This work is best done by or in coordination with forestry professionals and organizations like the FGCA. Another really important action we should all be doing now is planting or creating seed production areas and seed collection areas. We can't do this work without seed. I encourage woodlot owners to identify the vulnerabilities in their forests and evaluate species on a case-by-case basis. And of course, along with all these actions, clear documentation is required so we can identify what works and what doesn't. To summarize, I want to leave you with a few things to remember. Climate change impacts will vary greatly across ecodistricts and species. With any action, we should always consider local practitioner knowledge, on-site conditions, and of course, what forest is around us. Moving forward, we will need to collaborate with other regions, including the US, and as woodlot owners, collaboration with your neighbors will become increasingly important. I also want to state again that predictions are not guarantees, and some impacts will remain unknown. But with diversity through species, population, and individual genetic diversity, we can buffer our forests to the unknown. Climate change is going to have a lot of negative impacts, but we have tools to turn some of the negatives into positives with genetic diversity at our base. We can create resilient forests. This was a very brief overview of some of our recent work and some other seed and climate change related principles and projects that we work on. If you're interested in knowing more or would like access to the report, I encourage everybody to reach out through our website. I also strongly recommend checking out Natural Resource Canada's plant hardiness website if you want to explore some individual sort of climate and predicted species ranges in your area. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. Excellent presentation. I think you've given the members of the Ontario Woodlot Association and Eastern Ontario Model Forest some food for thought. And I know I have a couple of questions, but I think I'll go to the Q&A, and there's, I think, one in the chat here too. So let me just try to find that. There we go. One question from Peter. What happens to existing biodiversity when new species are brought in as seeds?
Yeah, that's a fairly complicated question, and we don't totally know 100%, which is why any of those things are to proceed with caution. So that's why the first action that we talk about is that assisted population migration. So you're bringing in a seed source that's of the same species, but just from a different area. And the other things where we're talking about a little bit of that range expansion, that's where a lot more caution, a little bit more slowly done, but it is along that natural range, right? Everything is going to be wanting to shift. it just can't shift fast enough. So it will cause shift in ecosystems, but generally a lot of those species are going to want to be shifting together. So one species might be coming in and do really well, and if another species is starting to die out because of that, it likely might be because it wasn't right for there. But we obviously want to avoid bringing in really novel species, like bringing something that is not native to anywhere near here and introducing it into the landscape. That is not a great idea and has a lot of risks associated with it. But otherwise, it's mostly just helping along the natural shifts that would happen naturally if we didn't build cities in the middle of everything and, you know, all that sort of thing.
That's really well explained. I was saying, you know, what you know, some people might be asking, what's the difference between an invasive versus something you're assisting in migration? There's a big difference. You know, you said it well, that a lot of these species, all of these species that we're assisting could potentially occur naturally, and they're going to eventually occur naturally in the new areas based on climate change. So yeah, if I paraphrased you right, I hope I did.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's obviously very different. It's not like we're bringing in Eurasian species that like have more of a tendency to become extremely invasive and damaging to our environment.
Right on. Yeah. And just a comment from Julia, very clearly presented and explained. Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Julia. And I'll go over to the Q&A where we got some questions here. And from Laura, sorry, I missed the part where you were talking about winter harvesting. Were you suggesting to not harvest during the winter? Should harvesting season be adapted to accommodate these expected climatic changes?
It's not saying don't harvest in the winter. Some of it is just that with the changes that are going to occur, you're likely to see a shorter harvest window where it's safe and that ground is frozen and you're not likely to do a lot of damage. We're more likely to see a lot of time where the ground is unfrozen. So bringing in large machinery is more likely to do damage to that forest floor and kind of ecosystem as a whole. So, and or getting machinery stuck, right? And not being able to get your harvest even out. So that's more the comment towards, we just have to might be a little bit more flexible, or it might be something that we might have to shift to taking a little less than we're used to because we just can't get in, or if you really want to, finding another time of year that may be less damaging. It's not saying don't harvest, it's just saying we're going to see changes. It's going to make it more difficult, and year over year is going to be different.
Here's one from Janet. How does shorter daylight in spring and fall affect species brought in from the south, even for range expansion?
Yeah, so the difference in daylight, because we're bringing something adapted from a different place, so far from what we've seen, and there's not really a lot of evidence that species are super adapted to those light levels. A lot of species adaptation work that they've looked into and tried to look at every variable imaginable. Most species are really strongly linked to that sort of mean annual temperature and growing season length associated with it. So light levels not seeming to play as much of a factor as, say, temperature. But every species is different, you know, every species is going to react differently to our changing climate. You know, for the most part, a lot of species that don't start too early are actually probably going to be species that are easier to move versus species that get going really early in the spring are going to be more likely to see damage because of those late frosts or other things and shifting them. They want to get going, and you know, our current climate is a little colder and hasn't really is less forgiving for some of those species.
Right on. Laura just said thank you for the answer to the previous question, so that's great. I had a couple of questions myself. I guess one, do you have sort of specific resources and materials for woodlot owners in terms of, establishing some seed production areas or I know you encouraged us to look at doing some key things. What kind of resources do you have available that we could share and get them on the right track and doing it in the right way?
Yeah, for the most part, right now, we've been kind of doing these on a scale with a specific partner, usually a conservation authority or something where we know, because these are long-term projects, right? To be planting these, you want to make sure that it's something that's going to be here 50 years from now. So private land isn't always the greatest unless you know it's something that is going to be passed down through generations or carried on somehow. We've looked at conservation easements and some of those things because we do have one of our trials on a private landowner site and it's doing quite well. But we've kind of been generally helping people develop those and haven't put it to a broader scale. We are looking to kind of create a little bit more of a recipe guideline book. So far as for woodlot owners, if you're doing it yourself, it's probably going to be more using some of those local sources, or if you can get something from a little bit further south in at a nursery, which is good too, right? We still need our local genetics. Those are still doing well in this area. You'd be unlikely without partnering potentially with FGCA or another kind of organization to bring in a lot of assisted migration stock. And some of it is even just management of you can manage part of your woodlot, right? Like if there's, we'll hopefully develop something soon, but I'll give you a little bit of a quick tidbit of some things that you could do, say, for taking a chunk off of your woodlot where say you've got a lot of good red oaks that are coming up, right? Medium age, you can start kind of thinning to what we want is open, a little bit more open to sunlight to encourage flowering, which encourages seed production. So kind of opening up the crowns, thinning it out. So looking a little bit less like a woodlot and a little bit more like parkland. So that kind of produces the most amount of flowers, the most potential for seed, and still has lots of potential neighbors it can get pollen from. So those are kind of some of the critical is like minimum number of actual individuals, opening up the crowns so that they have better access to light, more flowering sites, those sorts of things. But I am hoping in the future we'll have something a little bit more better resource wise for creating things like that.
Well, this might be a little self-serving, and I don't want to monopolize the question period here because there are some more questions in the Q&A, but I see, and Carrie and I have talked about this, I see a real opportunity to do a theme issue of the Ontario Woodlander, our magazine, not just for our members, but for broader distribution that would help folks to work on this. And I think there's enough good material and science and practical tidbits like that, Kristen, that we could, within the next year, produce something like that really helps folks. So
definitely, and as I say, even identifying some of those good collection areas, that even if it's something there's not resources to manage for seed production, but you naturally have, a good collection of a bunch of oak trees in an area that still make for a reasonable collection site, like documenting those and identifying them still goes a long ways.
Oh, right on. Excellent. Okay, so we've opened up the floodgates here now. They were a little slow to come, but we got about 8 questions in the queue for you. Kristen, that's great. So from Jean St. Pierre, can you comment on the possible benefit of collecting seeds from trees that are subjected to a disease, which may have modified their genetic makeup to resist or attempt to the disease? Butternut canker may be an example.
Well, maybe I should put that over to Heather to talk, as she's our species conservation coordinator and runs the Butternut recovery program.
Right on.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. Can you comment on the possible benefit of collecting seeds from trees that have been subjected to a disease and which may have modified their genetic makeup or, kind of adapted to resist the disease? And butternut canker is maybe an example.
Right. Honestly, I'm not a pathologist, so I wouldn't feel comfortable to weigh in on that specifically. So I'm sorry. We can look into that. Absolutely, though. Unless, Kristen, you have something you want to mention.
Well, I was just going to mention some of the things that we're doing with the butternut recovery program and identifying trees that are callousing over butternut canker, appear to be healthy while there's other ones that are diseased next to it. In most breeding programs, it's usually finding the ones that are surviving despite the disease. Or seem to show some resistance to it. Like coming up in the future, there might be with beech bark disease, right? If you have a forested woodlot that, the majority of the trees are riddled with beech bark disease, and you have some trees that aren't, it's not necessarily to say that they do have resistance. There could be other reasons why that tree didn't get disease. But the hope is there might be something there. And that's where with the butternut recovery program, we've brought trees from across the province that appear to be doing well despite the occurrence of butternut canker. It's not to say 100% we know their resistance, but bringing together at least these trees that appear to be doing well despite the canker, and hopefully bringing those genetics together to then produce seed, and hopefully there's some genetics in there that have some resistance. But yeah, as far as that's getting into a lot more advanced science of getting into genetic testing and finding exact resistance for things, and whether those genes are turned on or off, and that's beyond what we're currently working on.
I find this area fascinating and a little bit of a mystery too, even though I took some genetics courses at university. But I'm thinking that really what's enabled the American elm to come back now and will ensure its future is that very thing. They found the resistant trees and bred them, and they don't fall to the Dutch elm disease. And the same, I think, can be said hopefully with the American chestnut. So working on that too in the same way. So
yeah, we have to remember that trees have been around a lot longer than we have, and they have a lot bigger genetic makeup than we do. They got a lot more genes than we do, and a lot more possibilities in that way. So even if something isn't showing, it might still be on the recessive end of that gene in that tree. So there's a lot of possibilities, and there is a lot of people who are out there doing some of that really detailed genetic work.
Yeah, and someone just commented, well, Carrie, that is actually woody plant species genome is larger than our human genome. We have so much more to learn, more questions than answers. So exactly. Yeah, again, I think of the little brown bat and the situation we were having with the white mouth or fungus disease, and the ones that are resistant survived, and now they're starting to come back. It looks like, at least that's the hope. All right, I got to stop talking here and start moderating. From Manon, is black cherry a potential tree to favor in the future? And someone from Southwest Quebec. It's
somewhat in the middle. It's not like a yes, this is going to be great. It's also not maybe on the losing end. It somewhat depends where you are. Likely in Quebec, you're still okay for a while, because it's not something that maybe does well super deep south, but sort of in that mid-range, kind of like yellow birch is sort of, we don't really know. It's going to be, I think, a little bit area specific, but it's definitely not a loser per se, like some of the, I hate to say losers, they're not losers. All the trees are wonderful, but won't do as well. you know, but yeah, black cherry, middle of the road as far as I can tell. You'd have to look very specifically at an area and do a detailed look at it, but overall, middle of the road.
Yeah, oh, fair enough. On this, more a comment from Jean Saint Pierre, who asked that question earlier about the resistance. Said there's a suggestion from a researcher in BC that keeping trees that are not in best health may very well be very useful to produce more tolerant species to diseases. And I think we kind of covered that, but he says, thanks for your answer and excellent presentation. Thanks, Jean. Okay, very informative and useful presentation. Thank you, Kristen. Okay, this is good. You're a hit. Okay, I'm located in Sault Ste. Marie. This is from Margaret. I think I know who Margaret is. Assisted migration. Are there issues with bringing seeds across the border? Would it be a better idea to bring in seed-rooted cuttings from desirable species from southern Ontario, just in case of pests?
Most seed, like it depends on the species. Like it's still having to obviously go through phytosanitary requirements, and seed is much safer than bringing in trees. And it depends. Like most of the, say, insect pests that would occur in seed are widespread. You're unlikely to necessarily be bringing something in. But also you're likely going to be growing that out somewhere, and if something did occur, but the difference, like the border, US versus Canada, it doesn't, Southwest Ontario, you know, is farther away than right across in the US, where you are from Sault Ste. Marie, right? So it's not, our borders don't mean anything to plants and trees and insect pests and everything like that, right? So it's just as much a risk bringing it from Southern Ontario as, say, Northern Michigan across to Sault Ste. Marie. But that definitely is something that's a consideration with assisted migration. It's considering potentially bringing in pests and diseases, like, and those vectors, right? You'd want to look at each individual species and ensure, like, does oak wilt potentially transmit on seeds? Not that I know of, but that's something, you know, we want to make sure that we look very closely at before we bring seed in. But there's a lot of those kind of major big diseases that don't transfer on seed, or they're already endemic across the range of that species. So everything with caution, but no more risk than anything else. And I mean, if you want to look at it, the horticultural industry with ornamental plants have been moving things for centuries. So this is very low risk by comparison to what we do with ornamental horticulture and the bedding plants that we buy in, and roses that we buy, that everybody bought at Valentine's, right? That has just as much potential, if not more potential, to bring in foreign pests and diseases. So yeah.
Oh, great answer. Thanks, Kristen. From Leah, will this recording be sent out to participants? Yeah, within a day or so, we'll have a link to the YouTube channel for OWA, and it'll be free and open access to anyone. So yeah, we will do that. All right, and another person, unfortunately, need to leave a little early, but wanted to thank you for your time and expertise. There you go. That's nice. Thank you there. From Kate, I saw a couple of species mentioned, example, beech, which are currently struggling with other systemic issues, and beech bark disease. Does that affect their suitability for assisted migration?
Not necessarily so far as affecting suitability for assisted migration. You can still do that. It's more evaluating, I guess, whether, and maybe this was your question, evaluating whether that species is the best in the long term. I think beech is something that is so important to a lot of our forests that we don't really want to give up on it. But it's definitely not something that we're maybe going to rely on as heavily in the future. but it really critically important masting species with its seeds. But I mean, there's a lot of foresters already looking to kind of switch and transition to find integrating more oaks to provide some of those nuts for wildlife and things. Yeah, we don't want to give up on any species, right? I think it's still a consideration, but mind you, beech is very difficult to collect a lot of seed of. So that would also make it more difficult for assisted migration. But definitely it's still a consideration. The other aspect that I didn't maybe mention before with a lot of those species that are really widespread, things like some of our beeches, some of our oaks and pines, they have a less maybe local adaptation and sort of genetic variation over, because they have really good gene flow, because they're sort of these long-standing large ranges, very common species. So may have less of an issue with some of the climate change factors as some of the other species that have more isolated populations, less common, where there's usually a lot more local adaptation. I'm sort of really generalizing here, but
Okay,
yeah.
no, that's great. Thanks, Kristen. Still a few more questions open. I know we're past time, but I think there's a really great discussion going on here. So let's keep it going. From John, just wondering if provincial forestry policy is following your science as presented.
Yeah, so the ministry, which was the Ministry of Natural Resources, now a very long acronym. They have recently, in the last couple of years, put out a seed transfer policy, and there's actually public access to that. They have a tool. It's on Tableau Public. So if you search it, Ontario Tree Seed Transfer Policy, Tableau Public, you can actually go on there and look at what they have recommendations for. And they are encouraging and asking forest managers, which this only applies to foresters who have public funding, so and or work on Crown land. So our sustainable forest licensees, Crown land managers, for the most part, there's not really anybody in Southwest Ontario that this applies to. But they have, within the seed transfer policy, it is including assisted migration and some recommendations. It's fairly broad and fairly open. We prefer to do a little bit more precise when we're looking at it. They're also only, within that policy, is only looking at low emission scenario and very short-term future. So in some of the work that we do, we like to kind of look at various scenarios and looking a little bit further into the future without pushing it too much, still showing caution there. But yeah, so they do, it's just maybe a little bit more cautious and a little bit more broad than some of the work that we do. And it only is sort of governing mostly Crown forest managers.
And here's a question from Haste. With the declided ash from the borer, is there a specific opportunity for assisted migration in this forest type?
So far as other species, or
I think more the ash, the emerald, or the black ash and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you know, it's actually interesting because most of the ash species seem to be like they're climate change winners in sort of how tough and variable habitats they can live in outside of black ash, but green ash, white ash, those sorts of species, climate change wise, would do very well. But obviously and this is where it all depends, right? Something could be a climate change winner, but if there's not a lot of material to source from, one of our biggest issues with, you know, ash and trying to source material for assisted migration is there's not a lot of trees left. They're so fragmented that they're not really the quality of seed. Realistically, what we need for those, this is if somebody wanted to repopulate and kind of maintain ash on the landscape, this would be really where we would need seed orchards, seed production areas, and those sorts of things, because the populations that exist, especially remaining in the Southwest, are really not great seed sources for kind of repopulating in our forest.
Yeah.
So hopefully some work. I mean, there's been some, the government has put out for writing the recovery strategy for black ash, as it's most recently become listed, which is still very common in the north, and there's almost nothing left down in the south. So really sad that way. But yeah, a lot of work. FGCA, we've considered trying to get into some work, but of course funding has to come from somewhere to do all that work, of course. But
Right on. Just a comment from Robert. This was excellent and informative. Thank you. Thank you, Robert. And from Margaret, just a thank you for the answer to her question. And from Ashik, studies show that growth, volume production at a given location is influenced by more than seed source climate. Have you considered any impacts on volume production with assisted migration?
I'm not 100% sure whether I maybe totally understand what asking there, but I'll maybe go for what I'm thinking the question is about. So yeah, I know, and that's where, like, with a lot of these things, this is one, you know, I say this is one variable. We have to look at all the variables. You know, there has been studies say primarily on a lot of our conifer species, which are mostly what's used in forestry, which is where, you know, economy drives research for that. So there has been research, say, on a lot of those conifer species, some of them showing that they actually have a certain level within their genetics to adapt to a slightly warmer climate and are likely to see some growth, which would hopefully translate to that volume of timber. But there's also the factors of increased drought, which can negatively impact it. It's something I know, like, a lot of people are working on, and it's a really complex dynamic of things between seeing increased growth from the standing genetics of those tree species versus increased growth that we can see. But generally that increased growth is going to be first seen with species that are really within their more center of the range currently, versus, say, like boreal species, which are on their very southern range. Most of the way along the gradient are going to predicted to see some potential increase in growth with the warming temperatures, except along the bottom lagging edge, which they just can't tolerate because it's really starting to get outside of their ideal range. Along with some of that research, there's also certain research with some of those that actually taking a population that is closer to the 80th to 90th percentile of a species range actually has the most potential growth out of any sources. So, which adds another complicated layer in and of itself. But generally, of most species, the center to the sort of closer to the bottom half, but not bottom, are going to have the most growth potential in most areas that they land. So I feel like I got off track there, and I don't know whether that totally answered that question.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Kristen. Good. Just a few more here from Ray Bonenberg. Hey, Ray. I get asked this a lot by media on the future of the maple syrup industry due to climate change. What's your view, please?
Oh, yeah. So sugar maple seems to be, again, dependent on where it kind of is occurring. Again, kind of like black cherry. Some things say it's okay. Some things say it's might have some decline. I think that's going to be a species that is we maybe want to make sure that it's really in the right site where it really wants to grow. I think one of the bigger things that might be an issue, which is sort of right on our border, is oh my gosh, what's that new moth? I'm having a blank here. Heather, do you remember what the moth is?
That impacts maple?
Yeah, well, tree of heaven, but also maple.
Oh,
and
this,
everything.
is it the stripy one?
Yeah,
Yeah, a lantern
Yeah.
fly?
yeah, lanternfly. I think there's going to be things like that and other insect pests that I think might do more damage. Spotted lanternfly. There we go. That's what you put. I think
Spotted,
some of
not
the-
stripy, sorry.
Yeah. That might have more damaging effects than some of the climate change, but there is also that might be something though that with assisted migration to maintain growth levels in some of those maple stands. I don't want to pull random research reports out of anywhere, but like I know some of the like minor trials that have been done, you know, they've seen a lot more growth when they've moved southern sources up. Not to say that that's going to happen everywhere, but hopefully then that's sort of an indicator that it might be okay with you know, climate change and movements. It's a candidate for assisting to adapt to climate change. But yeah, it's not something that comes out from what I've seen as a clear winner or a clear loser again, but climate change is going to affect tree growth of everything, especially if we choose to do nothing. In the short term, overall, we might see an increase in growth of some tree species with that increase in warming outside of, unless we have major drought events and issues with moisture, that's sort of its own issue, but likely to see a bit of increased growth at first because of that sort of natural plasticity within a lot of species. But then after that, as the climate continues to change, that's where we start seeing stress and maladaptation of local populations. So further into the future, there's also some studies that have suggested with trees that to kind of keep that adapted genetics, that we might actually have to increase harvest cycles to a shortened window to try and have some more turnover of genetics to help with stands adapt and things, because there's some of our practices right now that even you know, cutting down a red oak and then we might be relying on resprouting, but that tree still has like the genetics from, you know, 100, 200 years ago. It's not really even adapted to today's current climate. And now our climate is shifting so drastically. So there's a lot of avenues. So far as maple syrup in general, I think it still has good hope to continue, but I definitely see it shifting. If we don't do something, it will probably decline later into the future.
Thanks, Kristen. That's a big topic in itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just Ashik said, thanks, very, very helpful for the answer you had to his question about production and volume, and excellent session. Yeah, we'll get rid of that one. And just a couple more is from Peter. Is work being done with nurseries like St. Williams, which does a lot of seed collection for native trees and herbaceous species?
Is work being done, like so far as
I guess actually producing seed.
I mean, they're collecting locally for their production, of course. And like we have a couple other partners that we're working with, Somerville and Ferguson Tree Nursery, that we've traditionally been more active partners with. We've been trying to develop more partnerships with places like Guyana, say, Verbinens, you know, some of those other nurseries, because it's going to be more than just one nursery. but so far working with places like, say, Somerville, for example, who's worked also closely with Forest Ontario, and they're already bringing in, trying to get seed from southern sources for people who are doing climate adaptation programs. St. Williams, to the best of my knowledge, isn't doing specific work for partners in that way. But yeah, we definitely need more nurseries on board.
Are there co-evolved species that also cannot move rapidly that need to be considered when implementing assisted migration?
Yeah, so generally with some of those species, as per if you're considering it like natural migration, if something has those two species naturally have a very similar climatic niche, that climatic niche is likely going to move to the same location. So it is likely that, you want to consider those ecosystems, individual tree species, and also ecosystems as a whole and intermingled species. So for the most part, a lot of species are not necessarily like they have to grow next to these other ones. But yeah, so far as the whole ecosystem functioning together, they rely on other things, nurse trees and that sort of aspect, I'm assuming is kind of partially what you're referring to. But generally an ecosystem is going to, its climatic niche is going to shift. So it does make sense to try and sort of shift that ecosystem together. But there's going to be limitations on that because of certain species that are difficult to propagate and or collect seed of and move together. And regen on all these species happens differently. I think for the most part, it's taking a page from afforestation is that a lot of times we might have to just bring in a lot of those pioneer species first, have your secondary species coming in afterwards, and you're shifting it in stages is likely what's going to be more realistic to do.
Yeah. Just a comment from Carrie. Ultimately, to hedge our bets, we want lots of healthy individuals and larger core forests that are contiguous. Well and sustainably managed woodlots that are prioritizing forest health and natural regeneration will be our best bet. Planting and introducing alternative seed sources is the next step and not possible for everyone to consider, understandably.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The other thing too, not to be negative on the topic, because I don't think it's a negative thing, but I think oftentimes when it comes to conservation and some of these things, a lot of us get stuck on wanting to keep everything the same. The world is evolving. The world has changed so many times over. Species have come and gone for various reasons. Even without human-induced climate change, our ecosystem was changing every day. And I think there's a certain amount that we're going to also have to accept that it's not going to look like it has always for us. Some things are just going to change and be different. And some of those species assemblages may just no longer exist. But we'll have new ones,
Oh, that's a really good point. I forget what the statistic is, but it's well over 90% of the species that have ever existed on the planet are now extinct. That's just a sad fact. That's the way evolution works. But one last question here, Manon. Should black walnut be encouraged in plantations in the future?
I'm assuming you're meaning kind of moving that direction. Black walnut has already been planted, the Ottawa Valley Way for quite a period of time already, and seems to be doing okay. It's showing that it definitely is falling within range. I think it's a good species for the future. But still, of course, as I say, caveat with caution, exploring all your issues, looking at potential risks and those sorts of things, trialing things first before moving the broad scale. But yeah, I think that's definitely a species that will do okay in the future, especially in Eastern Ontario.
Well, thanks, Kristen. You've been a trooper. We're about 20 minutes past the hour, and lots of good questions and great answers, and just really well done. Thanks again for a wonderful presentation and very thought-provoking. Just wanted to once again thank our many sponsors for the 35th Kemptville Winter Woodlot Conference. There's quite a number of them, and this is possible. These Zoom webinar license costs and all the organization and time costs. So it's wonderful we can get this sort of program out to our members and beyond. And again, we thank the Forest Gene Conservation Association of Ontario for their time and effort too. Well, we got one more comment in the chat here. I'm just going to see. Oh, someone's clapping. That's great. lots of good positive response today. Dorothy, did you want to say a few quick words at the end here, and we can close off?
I'd like to say thank you to all that joined us for our noon hour webinar. It seems to be a great success. Hope everybody enjoyed their soup and whatever as they watched. And I'd like to thank Kristen for her time and very good presentation. And to thank her, we have a small present for her. It's called a book, and it's called Around the World in 80 Trees. So hopefully some of those 80 trees can give her an idea of on assisted migration.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I just was going to share the little promotional here on that book, which I want to get a copy of too. I'm going to borrow it from Al Stinson, who received it last week for his presentation. It looks like a really good read. So there you go. That's great. Thanks, Dorothy, and thanks again for all your work and the committee's work to make this happen. So excellent presentation and a good turnout, lots of discussion, a good discussion. So everyone, thanks for participating. We'll see you next Wednesday for our final session of the Kemptville Winter Woodlot Conference. It's, oh, I should have had this ready, Dorothy. It's Steve, right? Yeah, sorry, you're muted. Steve from the University of Guelph.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, and he's going to be looking at common diseases of wildlife in certain species, and should be interesting for woodlot owners as well. So thanks again, Heather and Kristen and everyone, and we'll see you next week, next Wednesday at noon for the final session. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.